What was worse, Taylor, one time scourge of the powerful, now stood accused of having become the sycophant of his newspaper boss, the controversial tycoon Lord Beaverbrook.
I've never known anybody who made you yourself, when you're talking to him, made you feel an important person too. He was so fascinated about it. He had charity, he had a wonderful old world courtesy. He was in all things the most charming, delightful, entrancing character I've ever known.
I loved him, that's all. I can't say any more. I've not loved many people in my life, and he was one whom I loved.
I've heard him say things that embarrassed me, like of Beaverbrook. I loved that man. Well, I know what he means. He was much more fond of him than he ever thought he would have been before he knew Beaverbrook, but it won't quite do to... didn't do for me him to say that sort of thing about Beaverbrook, because he'd been a man who was so critical of everybody like Beaverbrook before.
None of this was helped by the turbulence of his private life, also raising eyebrows in 50s Oxford. His first marriage to Margaret Adams had collapsed shortly after the war. The mother of his first 4 children, she had put their relationship under intolerable strain with 2 disastrous infatuations, first for Taylor's favourite undergraduate pupil, historian Robert Key, and later for the poet Dylan Thomas. Taylor remarried in 1951. His new wife was Eve Crossland, the sister of the future Labour cabinet minister Tony Crossland. But even this, Oxford found hard to swallow.
Marriage for a second time was absolutely unacceptable to many of the dons here in Oxford. He was denounced at a college meeting as a fornicator, and his wife, having visited the college only once, although she lived just on the edge of the college, never came here again. This was the moral climate which Taylor came into, and it was a deeply hurtful reaction to something of which he had been the innocent party, was, I think, also instrumental in ostracizing Taylor from his colleagues and from the university generally.
All of this reached a head in 1957 when the top history job in the country became vacant, the Regius Professorship of History at Oxford. Despite years of being a thorn in the flesh of the establishment, few doubted Taylor wanted the job with all the prestige and recognition that went with it.
Now, it wasn't the job itself that matters. No one knows who the Regius Professor is today, and probably don't know who the last 2 or 3 Regius Professors have been. But the fact that Taylor was in the contest, and that the chief rival appeared to be an establishment candidate, Hugh Trevor Roper, made it a cause célèbre. And for Taylor, this was the climax of his career. This was his chance to join the establishment, to, as it were, come aboard.
Taylor was the favourite to get the job, but needed the endorsement of his old mentor, Louis Namier. Namier, however, hated Taylor's journalism.
His story about the Regius chair was that Louis Namier had said that if he was going to be put forward for it, he would have to stop writing for the press. And Taylor, I remember telling me, said, well, he just put the phone down and said, they may be your principles, Louis, they're not mine, and he never spoke to him again.
Namier declined to put Taylor forward, and the job went to Hugh Trevor Roper. Taylor claimed he would have refused the job anyway, but he made little secret of how disappointed he really was. He refused to forgive Namier for what he saw as an act of betrayal.
There was a great deal of hostility to him in the university. Hostility which I thought unreasonable at the time, although I must admit that his behavior afterwards did give some retrospective justification to the hostility. It was a sign of his vanity, which I had not fully appreciated until then. When he took it so ill, he said he had been slighted in his profession. He was entitled to take umbrage about it and go berserk. It was an insult to him. He had the right to it. He ought to have been appointed. Namier had no right to be objective in between him and me in speaking to the Prime Minister. He ought to have nominated him. He refused to speak to Namier after that, refused to visit him on his deathbed. It was a terrible story. So there again you see the inconsistency and unpredictability of his character.
Adding it all up, Taylor never really did get quite the recognition that was due to him. There were historians who did feel that he was being ill-treated, not so much because of the jobs that he didn't get, but the kind of snide remarks that were made about him in the background.
Most undermining of all was the charge made by younger historians that Taylor's style of narrative history was old-fashioned, for all its desire to shock. By the 60s, history had moved away from the study of high politics and great men in favor of sociology and economics.
I think Taylor, as a historian, is a dated historian. The kind of history he believed in was the history of events. He was fashionable in one sense, even in today's terms, in that he saw the role of accident in history, and the fact that somebody was ill at a crucial point really mattered in terms of the working out of events. But he was very suspicious of the history which involved analysing deeply the interrelationship of different factors. He never integrated economic and political history in any of his books.
So, in a sense, by the 60s, what Taylor was doing was important, but it was no longer seen as the mainstream of what a good historian would do. There were other things to do. Now, this didn't mean that anyone cast aspersions on AJP Taylor because he was a diplomatic historian. It did mean that more and more it could be seen as something that was only half history.
But Taylor's books could still capture the imagination of huge numbers of readers, even if thought out of vogue by professional historians. This was never more apparent than with his English History 1914 to 1945. In it, he expressed his sympathy for traditional British liberalism, which had had its finest hour in the victory over fascism in 1945.
In the Second World War, the British people came of age. This was a people's war. Not only were their needs considered, they themselves wanted to win. Future historians may see the war as a last struggle for the European balance of power or the maintenance of empire. This was not how it appeared to those who lived through it. The British people had set out to destroy Hitler and National Socialism. Victory at all costs. They succeeded. No English soldier who rode with the tanks into liberated Belgium or saw the German murder camps at Dachau or Buchenwald could doubt that the war had been a noble crusade. The British were the only people who went through both world wars from beginning to end. Yet they remained a peaceful and civilized people, tolerant, patient, and generous. Traditional values lost much of their force, other values took their place. Imperial greatness was on the way out, the welfare state was on the way in. The British Empire declined, the condition of the people improved. Few now sang Land of Hope and Glory, few even sang England Arise. England had risen all the same.
I am English, very much English. I like some other countries, but I'm not associated with them. I think we've shameful things in our record, but also very great things. And I think if other people model themselves on us more, they could still benefit from it. That's why I am so hostile when things which are done which seem to me to go against the great British traditions of toleration and acceptance of the other man's point of view.
But for people who didn't read academic history, Taylor's popular appeal lay undiminished. The BBC resurrected his television lectures in 1977.
Ladies and gentlemen, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the odd man out among the warlords of the Second World War. All the others had seen military service during the First World War in one form or another. Roosevelt was totally civilian. During the First World War, he was Assistant Secretary to the Navy, but this was a political appointment. Incidentally, it always made him regard the Navy thereafter as his special service. During the Second World War, General Marshall once asked him not to refer to the Navy as us and the American Army as them. It's not a question of memorizing it. These are subjects that I've lived with. I don't need to. Latterly, at any rate, when I've been doing them from Television Centre, when the taxi is bringing me along over the motorway, as it reaches the motorway, I begin to think of the subject. It used to take, before there was a motorway, it used to take 20 minutes, which gave me quite a margin. Now it gives me 10, so I have to think pretty fast.
Only once in the 20 programs that I actually did with him did did it collapse.